Welcome back to the AEC Disruptors Podcast, your platform to help push the AEC industry forward. Today, we have a special guest, Anthony Zuefeldt, Senior Solutions Specialist here at Applied Software. How's it going, man?
It's going great. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. This topic kind of caught us or interested us, and it was this idea of sort of looking at how we rebuild our firms moving forward, really with a technology focus. And before we even dive into the topic, I'm really curious, like, what has inspired you to even, look at this type of stuff and want to bring it onto the podcast?
Well, I think there's a lot of things at play that kind of touch on why this is such a focus of mine, and it goes back to kind of the threads that have shaped my career, but also current events, right? I think you talk about, with COVID and kind of we're exiting the pandemic now, at least in America. And there's a lot of things that are coming out of this that have really fundamentally reshaped the way we look at organizations and the way we operate. It's all interesting stuff. And really, there's an opportunity right now to potentially shift the way we operate as organizations in AEC to a space where we're working more as technology companies.
I think it's an interesting topic, and I'll be really interested as we go through and hear even from the construction perspective from Jackson, because you mentioned even, you equated it to Silicon Valley and the companies that come out of there. There's also this idea with a lot of those companies of sort of this startup mindset. The AEC profession, we've been around for a very long time, yet we still seem to be sort of stagnant in our growth. We hear about productivity issues all the time. We hear that we're laggards in technology. Why do you think we should, or what are your thoughts on why we should focus on the technology side and really start to emulate some of those startups, emulate how they run a business and how they build a business?
I think that's a really good question. And, I'm reading a book right now, and this is written by Marco Iancetai and Kareem Lakhani. And they're two professors at the Harvard Business School. In the book, it's called Competing in the Age of AI, Strategy and Leadership when algorithms and networks rule the world. And frankly, it's an amazing book. It was just released, and it has a lot of stuff that's really relevant to our topic today. This idea of digital organizations and operating as agile companies that make decisions on the fly and really leverage technology in every aspect of their business to make them better. So the book is pretty recent, and it has a foreword that talks about the disruption brought on by the pandemic. And there's one anecdote in there that I wanted to share with y'all, which was the story of Moderna and their efforts to develop a vaccine for COVID. Which, speaking of which, I just recently got my second shot, so I was kind of personally invested in learning about this origin story of the vaccine. So the origin story is January 5th, 2020, the World Health Organization releases its first report that notes a cluster of pneumonia cases in Wuhan, China, right? Something's not right. And pretty much immediately, Moderna takes note of this report and begins to take action. I mean, immediately. And this is really interesting because for most of the world, we didn't really latch on to this as a problem in the news cycle and kind of in public consciousness for another month or so, right? But Moderna recognizes something and pretty much immediately launches into action. And by January 13th, Moderna takes note of the report and begins to take action, right? Like they go right in, and their infectious disease team actually finalizes this digital sequence for the vaccine that they created.
Like a week later.
Right, in a week. We're talking a week here. And think about that, right? Like in just over a week, the company is able to, one, recognize a threat and a business opportunity, right? But they mobilize resources, develop a plan of attack, and execute the plan. So in just over a week, Moderna created the framework for a vaccine. Now, obviously, clinical trials still had to be conducted, to test like the impact and the efficacy rates. But, as we can see today, it's really been a tremendous success. And I think what's really interesting about all of this is how did Moderna come to a place as an organization so that it could so quickly identify a problem and construct a solution, right? Because think about a week. How many of us have been kind of like, even in some kind of minor clerical action, taking a week to get that approved? Or what about refocusing the efforts of an entire division? 1 week.
It
So,
takes me a whole week sometimes to respond to an email.
right, absolutely. I mean, it's crazy to think about. And I think that getting into the book, um, they interview the CEO of Moderna, Stefan Bontel, I think, and he describes his organization, Moderna, as a tech company that happens to do biology. A tech company that happens to do biology. I think there's a lot to unpack with that statement, but ultimately, that's something that I think is really critical in our industry in AEC. To be the best version of ourselves, we need to be tech companies that happen to do AEC.
I think it's interesting because I always say that people join this industry because of a passion for building or design or engineering, and they begrudgingly have to use the technology. They're sort of drug along half the time. And I still kind of believe that, but in a way, this argument is, instead of feeling that way, embracing it and saying, okay, well, we have this here, we have to use it. Now, how can I become the best tech company? And I use these things that we hear all the time, like all the buzzwords of lean and agile and all of those type of approaches to make quick decisions. Because I mean, I went to an interiors firm several years ago, many years ago, and I was sort of awestruck by how fast the CEO made a decision on something. And it was a result of, we were there to do some just sort of a la carte Revit training. And they just sort of got introduced to it. And I can't remember the specifics, but I was telling her about something else the team really probably could use. And I was just explaining what it was. And she asked like two questions, how much does it cost? How's it going to benefit me? And then she said, yes, go do it. And her response later, when I asked about, how are we able to make such a quick decision? Essentially, it's that, any decision we can always rectify or come back from or make accommodations or make updates. But the worst thing is no decision. And I think that's sort of it kind of starts to get to the heart of this idea of like a startup mentality, a Silicon Valley mindset, is the ability to just, one, make decisions and then continuously sort of try to act on or improve, said decision. Jackson, I'm curious, it makes sense on the architecture side, I think, but from construction, I mean, what is your thought of this idea of starting to change the way we manage our construction firms and think of them as technology companies that happen to perform, construction?
Yeah, I think it's a really uphill battle for contractors specifically, because they think of it from the perspective of, installing work to make money. And they don't really, a lot of the people in the field don't necessarily care about what went into, designing the building or, procuring all of the materials or anything like that. I think one thing that would help contractors is to and like get them into the startup mindset is to just go ahead and have a development team on staff, whether that's one person or 10 people, because no solution works perfectly for any contractor. And I'm sure it's the same way for design firms as well. There's always, the onesie twosie things. Well, I wish it did this, it would be better, if it worked this way, to fit specifically what we like to do. So I think that's something that they'll need, especially, in the years that are forthcoming, because, some contractors, they wait for the next great solution and then it comes out and it's a dud and it doesn't really help them. I mean, we've got people who are using, products that are, from 15, 20 years ago because, it works, best for their needs. So I think anytime something comes up that's a broken workflow, that's specific to, your own company, having a development team on staff to fix that would kind of be best. But I was thinking about this, between owners, contractors, and design teams, who's most likely to adapt or adopt a startup mindset first?
Well, I got to say, Jackson, something that's really interesting. You mentioned the notion of having developers on staff, and that kind of actually ties to the start of my career in the AEC industry. So, I was first introduced to this notion of tech companies, AEC companies, almost a decade ago with my first job out of college. And this was a production home builder home. So I thought it was interesting. A couple of episodes ago, you kind of alluded to, home building kind of sparking your interest in construction rather than, a football coach or something to that effect. I thought that was really cool because that's where I started, is in the production home building world with Beat and Bow Homes. And now Beat and Bow is they're on the Builder 100. They do 1,000+ homes a year, and they are the king of West Texas in home building. They have no peers, they have no rivals, and it's because of how good they are at what they do. And there's a few things that make that why they are so good. They have a really amazing organizational philosophy and kind of a creed around people and faith. Their mission is build, serve, impact. But what's really interesting is they're led by Cal, and this is the president. And he took over from Rick Beatonbow, who started the company. And what's very interesting is that Cal did not start in construction. He did not start in any kind of like building industry. He was in computer science, and he came on to Beatonbow as the developer, doing exactly what you're talking about. He started out going around to different teams looking for things that weren't working and built solutions, in-house solutions that solve those problems. Building tech solutions to elevate the company. And ultimately, that kind of became a theme at Beatonbow, that they leverage technology as the engine through which they share and track data and information and make decisions. And they do this in really effective ways. And, in this way, it's kind of unfortunate, but I see Beatonbow as kind of a unicorn in the industry, in that they are a tech company that employs a dev team, and they just happen to build homes. Like, that's their end product.
I think you hit on something there, because I've often thought about this idea of, my background's in architecture, and I chose to go the business route. I mean, I got a degree, an MBA, because I recognized there just seemed to be this void, or at least from my perception of a void, in terms of business acumen. There's all these sole proprietors, these partnerships, these, huge firms as well, but no one teaches us in architecture school how to run a business or, do anything to that degree. And I started to inquire about this idea of, does the best person to run an architecture firm, should they be an architect, or should they actually be, not an architect, because architects have a certain type of motivation that comes with it. I mean, they care about whether it's design or putting buildings together or whatever, but being able to put somebody at the top that doesn't have any of those preconceived notions of how the industry should work, doesn't have preconceived notions or motivations driving them regarding design, but strictly from business, whether they be just a typical business individual, maybe they have a finance background. And I started to really wonder, are those the individuals that might make up the best leadership for running a firm in today's AEC? Because it seems like normally what happens is either people on their own go out and start a firm and they have their stamp and they just run wild, or someone grows throughout the firm over many years. They go from what may be a project manager up to a principal level, finally up to maybe that CEO level, but they're still that professional. They've been inundated with the way things get done and how we've done it for so long. And, do we need to start to rethink our structure at the top to be able to instill this type of mindset for those firms that are trying to figure out, how do I do this starting today, instead of just like, if I was starting from scratch, is that the right approach?
Yeah. And, I think, it's something I've thought about a lot, is there's kind of this misalignment of incentives in the promotional structure within design firms today, where the principals are typically elevated for a variety of reasons, but I'd say one of the biggest ones is about driving business, right? Like bringing in revenue, making those connections, and ultimately driving business. And while that's 100% valid, I think that there's sometimes a gap because there isn't the focus on the process. And it's not just about, I think, I want to be clear about this. It's not just about tweaking old processes to make them more efficient. It's about redesigning operating processes to facilitate greater speed, efficiency, and innovation. And that focus, that way of thinking, doesn't necessarily immediately accompany someone that's good at driving a sale or making a relationship. And I think that we have to be very intentional as an industry and as leaders in industry to make this choice to say, we're not just going to prioritize getting business, we're going to prioritize evolving our own business.
It kind of reminds me of that quote that we pulled out for that recent presentation by Henry Ford, the "be ready to revise any system, scrap any method, abandon any theory if the success of the job requires it."
100%.
And because I think we're starting to talk about these two different things. Again, if maybe somebody started a firm today, like if you and I and Jackson started a firm today, maybe we would approach it from this idea of this startup mentality and let's run it like a tech company. But most people that would be listening or wanting to go this route already exist. And, how do they start to instill that? And it seems like that's something that kind of is culture focused, that has to build over time. Jackson, it seems like, we've talked before, the GC side for a lot of these tends to be a little harder to migrate, a little more reluctant to do some of this. What are your thoughts on this idea of instilling in the culture, and is this something that takes a while, this art or this idea of consistently reviewing our processes and being willing to scrap them and try something new? And do you think COVID and the sort of disruption it's brought has helped to accelerate any of that for those individuals who were kind of, had been doing it so long a certain way and then they had to do something differently?
So for me, I think COVID really accelerated working from the cloud for contractors. But as far as adopting a startup mindset, it's really difficult, especially for general contractors, because they are managing a bunch of subcontractors. that kind of do their things their own way. And there's only so much that you can put in a contract for a particular job, to make them, do things, basically change their process to fit, what your vision is as a company going forward. I think from a subcontractor perspective, it's a little bit easier because they manage their own labor, they procure their own materials, and most of them are moving towards prefabrication and are kind of disrupting their process already due to the skilled labor shortage that didn't just start. It's been around for many years now. I mean, I was in college and we were talking about it, and we noticed it whenever we were trying to find people, and we were a union contractor, so we should have been able to find people pretty easily. So I think it's really tough because you're tied to a contract and each job is different. It's a unique undertaking, and I just think it's a lot tougher from their perspective, the generals.
So then when we started setting up this talk, I was thinking about how do we structure the talk, but if I was trying to be that tech company that performs insert whatever discipline, I was like, oh, let's talk about culture. Let's be at high level. We'll work our way down. But maybe the right approach is talk about as an industry. It should be a mindset that we as an industry adopt. And so if we recognize there are parts of the industry that are more resistant for certain reasons, do we start with them? So you said the subcontractor might be slightly easier. Is it beneficial to start to look at that aspect of our business? And one question, they manage their own work, all the things you just listed. Is that the way that it needs to consistently go and continue to go? Are there parts of that aspect of the business that needs to be evolved? And so do we start to apply this mentality to the whole industry first and look at, these things we've been doing? We say we have all this technology and we can advance it. Do we need to start looking at the subcontractor and how they perform and how does that evolve, and then let that trickle upstream?
I think from a contractor perspective, it probably is going to go the other way around. It'll have to start from the owner, just like how BIM got widely adopted because owners said in their contracts that you had to do this. So
it's forced.
I think going back to my earlier question, between designers, contractors, and owners, who's going to be the first to adopt a startup mindset? In my mind, I really think it would be designers, just because, that side of the house has always been the one to adopt new technologies first. But from a contractor perspective, it probably has to be the owner because, or go ahead, Anthony.
I got some things to say. Whew, okay.
Yeah.
No, look, I almost want to disagree with you on this, and let me
go ahead.
Yes, let's get spicy.
Almost as in I will disagree, or
yeah,
I won't disagree.
Yeah. Look, here's my mindset: is back to who the disruptor is. I almost don't think it's going to be any of those, which is weird to say, but think about like the notion of Kodak, the camera company. These guys were the ones that really came to the scene with, the first real photography technology, right? So you go up into about 1900 or so, and really the predominant way of documenting the world was through painting. And then we have this paradigm shift into a technology where we push a button and it records an image. And that persisted for, that technology really persisted for about 100 years before digital photography kind of took over. And now when we think about like photographs and photography, it's not a camera, it's a phone, right? So who is the purveyor of photographs today? Who deals with that technology the most? It's not a Kodak, it's the phone companies, right? It's Apple. And so my point would be that when we talk about who can come in and disrupt an industry like AEC, I kind of think it's going to be an outsider that lets go of all of these preconceived notions that we have to manage risk and contracts and we have to do all of these things because that's the way we've always done it. I think someone is going to come in from the outside and say, I don't care about all that. I'm here to truly procure the greatest possible solution, whatever that looks like, and then I'll figure it out.
I think that's absolutely where it'll come from. Because I do think, to Jackson, to your point, we have a way of doing it. Maybe a lot of that's governed by law that we just can't picture a way out of that. And somebody will come in and they'll do it in a way where people, I think, somebody's going to say, that's not fair, you can't do that. And they're going to be like, well, why not? And we won't have an answer why we can't do that. But right now, we as that industry, we can't see another way.
Where do you think that comes from? I know a lot of people say manufacturing, but could there be another sector of industry that we get that from?
I think that's a logical one, but I mean, it may be the tech industry.
So going back to Beat and Bow as a production home builder, I kind of suspect that it'll be a design build entity that can bring it all in-house under one roof, right? Because like think about what it means if you have, you know, end to end, you're responsible for the design and you're responsible for the deliverable at the end, the building. You're able to kind of excise those layers of risk management, the contract between the owner and the architect, the contract between the architect and the engineer and the general contractor, that all goes away. And in its place, we kind of get this really nice laboratory where we can start to do rapid iteration and testing. Because think about, like, in the home building world, Beat and Bow does 1,000, they do more than 1,000, but let's just say they do 1,000 homes in a year. That's 1,000 different times for them to collect data from what they did, what worked, what didn't, and then to optimize, right? And potentially even to completely scrap and try something new. The stakes are so much lower when you do a thing 1,000 times, and it gives you that data that allows you to, you know, improve. Because without that data, we don't know what we're doing.
In a way, the industry would go full circle, because back in the day, the architect was like that master builder, and they kind of did it all. And then we broke all of that into pieces. And then I guess from your perspective, the only way to get to this level is to bring it all back. And, you know, I've said this on other podcasts. I learned in school, we talked a lot about integrated project delivery as kind of like the way, and we still haven't figured that out because everyone has different motivations. But if we were able to pull all that together, where we really do have the same motivation of what we're trying to achieve, which one firm tends to do, I think that would be a likely place. Jackson, what are your thoughts on this idea of a design builder, which do exist? That's not like an outside the norm thing, might be able to be the one to start to adopt this mindset.
Yeah, after hearing both of y'all talk about this and thinking about it a little bit, I think it probably would need to be a design builder, or at least that would be the quickest, you know, easiest fit, especially if they, you know, do have, like I said before, a nice development team on staff. Yes. Because, you know, it's the full circle of the project. And then, you know, you've got that development team there to fill in any gaps, whether that's something to help you with procurement, something to help you with the logistics of, you know, getting rebar delivered to a job site that's downtown, things like that. I think that would be, you know, the logical firm to do it. and the one that would be, have the easiest time doing it as well.
It'd be interesting to see if you start to see additional sources of revenue in these firms. Because when I think about, and then I'm just wondering, but you think about having these big development staff or departments on staff to be able to help customize any solution for yourself. Well, you could look at it two ways. One, you could be customizing it to create a competitive advantage, or you could customize it to then lease out to others and sell. And so you might have potentially companies that customize a certain thing to work the way they need, and then they license it. And so there's just an additional revenue that didn't exist before. So they're not using it so much as a competitive advantage, but more as an income generating sector of their business.
I find it puzzling that isn't a more common scenario. Like because if you were a technology company, you have your dev team and your applications and your solutions, and then almost like, okay, I also happen to build buildings using this technology. Great, it's an incubator, right? I can start to see what's working with what I built, and okay, I need to edit, I need to do these things, and then ultimately it leads to a better product. But it seems to me that the majority of the industry today, like the solutions that are out there, whether it's an Autodesk product or Dassault or something else, is it comes down to like they're really not doing the lab testing, at least at the scale that I think I'm alluding to here. And I think that's strange because it seems like a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I think so. And I think if we rethink, maybe we even rethink our business model in terms of where our revenue comes from in our industry. Because if we were, architects, somebody would argue, well, I don't have the fee or the time to be spending on paying a dev team or developing new tools. Yet if there was another component of my business that generated revenue so that I then had the funds to focus on things like that, maybe we could do it on a larger scale. I think in a way, we get ourselves in this way where we're just trying to keep up with our competitors, but we are at the same time staying stagnant, especially on the design side, it seems like. So yeah, we can adopt the newest technology and try to employ it, but it's still on a small scale. We've talked to some people that are doing really cool things, but it's on 1% of their projects, right? So it's like they're using it, but they're not gaining all the abilities. And so I wonder if for us to get there, we need to actually take a step even further back and say, how can, as a firm, we make money in a different scenario than we have been up to this point?
I think there's a really big disconnect between, management and developers at big software companies and, draftsmen and, general foreman, people working out in the field. Because it's very rare that you'll see a developer or a management person at big, software company actually out in the field, seeing how everything's going together, seeing what, a like a pipe superintendent's day looks like from day to day. And each day it's going to be different because projects are unique undertakings. That's why it's so difficult. So I think an important thing would be making sure, say design build company with nice development team on staff. What would be ideal is making sure that they are in constant contact with those who are on the front lines, whether that's, people who are designing the buildings or people who are putting them together, and making sure that they have a full understanding of what the current workflow is, down to a very detailed level. That way they can see, oh, here's, because on the contractor's perspective, we always think that we're right. we've been doing it this way for a long time, yada yada yada.
You don't say.
Yeah, exactly. But somebody coming in from an outside perspective who has a very technical mind can come in and say, well, why don't you do it this way? Or, you could use this and it could really help you, So just having full transparency from department to department, whenever you have the startup mindset, that's the way to make it work, I feel like.
I agree 100%. I think you're touching on something, Jackson, that I think is fundamental to the way we have to operate as a really in any business, is having that transparency, getting to a flatter organizational structure, if for no other reason to pull back the curtains and help everybody understand the process of how decisions are being made, right? Like when it's very opaque and you're just being dictated something, you don't necessarily understand the why behind it. And that why, when it's missing, can lead to a fundamental gap in what the solution needs to do.
I think that transparency is important too for these firms that want to build longevity into their business. And I always hear this, or I was told this mainly around the architecture again, but going from first to second generation is a really big step because of ownership and leadership, because the characteristics that typically make up that second generational leader are not the exact same that started the business. They potentially don't have the same drive and the same motivations that got it. Going from second to third, it's even harder. And then once you get to that third generation, you're far enough detached from the original vision that supposedly they're able to reform and do what they need. And so I think having that transparency in the very beginning of what the vision is and the goals and the outcomes, and making sure that it goes past just that boardroom, but through the whole firm, helps, I think, to start to build towards a more sustainable future. But then at the same time with that, there is this idea of instilling, we've talked about it before, that idea of sort of that continuous improvement growth mindset into your culture, so that all team members are sort of grabbing onto this idea of testing and iterating and all of that.
Right. I think every person in a company, in an organization, needs to feel a sense of ownership. And then you carry like two mindsets in there. One is focused on the individual responsibilities of the individual project. Okay, I have to execute. But the other 50% needs to be looking at it from a 10,000-foot level and saying, what am I doing now? How can we do better with this? How can we go bigger and really think about, again, that fundamental idea of improving process.
As we kind of wrap up, I'm curious if this sort of sums up the whole talk. Anthony, if you were building a firm today, you're about to start a firm, what does that makeup look like? If we talk about this idea of being a digital technology company that does AEC, are you a design build firm? Is your leader part of the industry?
How many podcasts does your company have?
Yeah. How many different podcasts do you yeah, exactly. Which we'll be having 3 soon. So you guys will have to listen for our manufacturing one. Nice plug. But yeah, so if you were starting a firm today, and kind of putting you on the spot, and you were summing up what our talk was today, what do you think that firm looks like, or the beginning of a firm?
Yeah, I think it needs 3 podcasts at least. And in all seriousness, I think that it depends on, you would have to work your way backwards from what is your product, right? Like understanding, I'm going to build something. Is my something a home? Is it a full apartment structure? Whatever that is, kind of understanding that's your output, and then working your way back into how do we best facilitate the creation of that output, and questioning. I don't want to necessarily use the templates of all the people that have, started different design or construction companies before me. I really just want to look in this pure analytical context of what is the best way to achieve an outcome of building a home, and construct my organization in a way that supports that. And to Jackson's point, it might very well be that I start out with a dev team, and the idea is I'm not interested in filling out the classical design roles and the classical contractor roles until I understand how I'm going to get there, and then I begin to construct that process. So to me, it really depends. I do lean towards believing it's design built, but I also think that it could look radically different than anything that we've really seen before in the industry. Like, no need to put restraints on us and say, okay, this is what a classical architecture firm looks like. I need to have my principal and my project managers and XYZ. If you approach it from that way, you're condemning yourself to be part of the group that will eventually be displaced.
I would always hear throughout my career that to be, the CEO or president or whatever of an architecture firm, again, you had to be licensed. Like that was the only way that you could be or even a principal for that matter. That was kind of the argument for a lot of firms. And I always would challenge that notion as, I understand the significance of a license for any professional. And there is a weight that goes with that. And there is a legality requirement that goes with that. But I think if we start to challenge the notion of what characteristics are required for leadership, what do we want to check? What boxes do we feel like they need to check? And have we been asking for the wrong thing? So we're missing out on really good talent that had a different route. Because I think if I was starting a firm today, I don't know. I think my most important thing I'd focus on would be just a diversity of thought at the top, right? Stay away from like the 1-2 type of deal. I always heard 3 was nice. 3 people was always nice because you can vote, but diversity of thought, and treat it as such, and find individuals that have their strengths in certain areas that complement each other in other areas. But really embodying this idea of these, all the buzzwords, the agile approach, and really trying to instill that in our culture, but not just because we wanted to, because it's a buzzword, but recognize that there is a benefit to speed. There's a benefit to making decisions quickly, and being able to then act on those decisions. I think you're right in that whatever firm disrupts a firm there will be someone is going to disrupt this industry, because it's going to have to happen. I think it'll look different than any firm we've seen. And part of me thinks when we see it, it's going to be like, oh yeah, of course that's what it is. Of course they have a chief visionary officer is at the top, and all he talks about she talks about is this, this, and this. So you know what? I really enjoyed these type talks. They're more broader. It's more, hypotheticals and speculation, but I think these talks are important because we need to get better about challenging the status quo. Even just talking about it is a important first step. Otherwise, we just fall into the same old, and we don't really move the needle very much. Before we end, we ask all our guests to define disruption, and so I'll give you your chance. How would you define disruption, Anthony?
Oh man, it's a good question. I love the question too, because it inherently will be different to each person. But disruption to me, I think it means what happens before disruption. So to disrupt, to change industries, it really requires a mindset. and a culture that questions those processes, questions the way we work, the way we do. And you have to challenge those base assumptions and really look for better ways of doing things. And through that perpetual quest, you achieve disruption and you become the change agent. So I guess that's what disruption means to me, the continual process of questioning processes in order to evolve and improve as an organization.
Keep asking why. Don't settle. We've enjoyed having you, man. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks. It was great to be here. Love chatting about this and always open to talking about this with others. So thank you.
Absolutely.